recording and going into the live broadcast. All right, so here comes everybody. I see we're up to 11 now, 13, 15. All right, hello to everybody out there. We're going to be getting started in just a minute here. All right, up to 23 attendees, 27. All right, well, more and more people are going to be coming in, but we'll get started here. So hello and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar today on grant writing. It doesn't have to be stressful to be successful. My name is Don Hall. I'll be the host for this webinar. And our presenter will be Jana Hexter of grantschampion.com. Before we dive into the main presentation, I'd just like to make a few announcements. First of all, this webinar is sponsored by Transition US, which is a national hub for the international transition towns movement of thousands of communities in 50 countries around the world, all working to build local community resilience from the bottom up. So if you're new to transition, I suggest you check out our website, transitionus.org. There you can learn more about what transition is, find a transition initiative near you, sign up for our e-newsletter, and donate to support programs like this one. Next, I want to tell you about a few other upcoming events that you might be interested in. We have this free monthly webinar series. This is our first one of 2019. We've recently scheduled another one for March called What the Climate is Missing. What the climate movement is missing. The climate isn't missing anything. More and more people and resources are focused than ever before on the climate crisis, yet we move closer to cataclysm. Why? What strategy or set of strategies will optimize and focus resources to produce speed and scale solutions? Those that produce massive greenhouse gas emission reductions fast. What is the climate movement missing and what can we do about it? And this will be with Anne Hancock, the Executive Director of the Center for Climate Protection, on Thursday, March 28th at this same time, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. Again, it's a free webinar, and you can register by going to transitionus.org. We've also recently opened registration for the second round of our Effective Collaboration online training, which I will be helping to teach with my co-instructor, Alberta Pedroia. That will start on April 9th. It will be a 6-week course with 6 pre-recorded lectures, 6 live webinars with Q&A, and interactive activities, as well as a discussion forum that you can use to share resources and engage in conversations between sessions. And I personally think this is an extremely important topic. You know, often what gets in our way of making real substantial change out in the world is not learning how to work well with each other, with those who were part of groups working together for social change with. So it's a very comprehensive course that brings together a lot of different insights, methodologies, practices, frameworks to help you become better at working in collaborative groups towards social change. So I hope you'll join us for that. That is also on our website. Finally, I want to explain a few things about this webinar format and platform. This webinar will run for approximately 90 minutes, beginning with some introductory remarks and a presentation by our presenter, followed by Q&A. This webinar is being recorded and shared on the Transition US Facebook page right now. We'll also be producing a recording that will be posted to our YouTube channel within the next few days that you're welcome to share with others. To preserve sound quality, everyone is currently muted except for myself and our presenter, but you can submit a question at any time by clicking on the Q&A module at the bottom of your screen. Or clicking on raise hand. And we'll mostly be taking questions at the end, but we may also take some questions throughout the course of this presentation. You can also use the chat function, particularly if you run into any technical difficulties that I might be able to assist you with. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Jana Hexter to talk to us about how grant writing can be stressful without being, can be successful without being stressful.
Thank you for catching that, because it's usually the other way around, right? Great. And you have some slide set that you were going to pull up, is that correct?
Right. Yes, I will put that up in just a moment.
Great.
Spotlighting your video, and we will do a screen share here. Let's see.
And while you're doing that, I would just say hello, and it's a delight to be with you. Actually, one of my very favorite people in Ithaca, she said to me, I just saw that you're doing a webinar with Transition US. So I'm just imagining in my head that there's 42 people that are just like her that I would absolutely love to spend some time with. So it's a delight to spend this time with you. And we've a couple of things before we dive into the content. And I love questions, by the way. I've been a grant writer for well over 25 years. And I've been teaching for way over a decade, so I'm familiar, and I love taking questions, and I'd be more than happy to use this time to empower you to be better and feel better about grant writing and be more successful. So if there's any questions that you have, feel free to dive in and use the Q&A feature. It's a little bit easier. I don't know how many of you have used Zoom as a presenter, but it's actually easier when they come through in the Q&A feature. And it also means at the end that John will get a report with the question in your email. So if something doesn't get answered, or I think about it later and want to email you, I'd be able to do that because it'll be in that feature. So we have a couple of questions to begin with, so that just so I know who is on the line. And John, can you pull up the poll questions for me, please?
All right.
There we go. And you should just be able to scroll down, and I would love it if you could just answer these questions, so I have a sense of who is on the call and can tailor it appropriately. I'll give you a minute to do that, and then Dan can let us know when most people have had a chance to complete it.
And somebody loves grant writing.
Just one?
Just one so far. Okay, it seems like a few more coming in. We'll give this maybe another 20, 30 seconds. Okay, well, that might be about it. I'm going to close the poll and display the results here.
All right, we have one person who loves it. Okay, great. And, half the people are daunted by it, which is kind of my experience too. And a lot of people who are less than 5 years experience and smallish size grants. And 20% of people have written a very large grant, over 100,000. And 86% of people have written less than 10 grant applications. So Don was spot on when he told me to kind of tailor this content to people who probably have less experience grant writing. So that's exactly what I've done. So we can stick to the agenda, and I will do my best to tailor my words to meet your needs. And so what I'd invite you to do now, if we can close up the poll, there we go, is if you can just grab a piece of paper or whatever you use as a writing device. And I'd just like to ask you, you're about to spend an hour plus of your time, an hour and 15 minutes going forward of your life. And time is the most precious thing that we have. After health, actually, I think health comes first and then time. And so I'd really like you to sit for a moment and write down on a piece of paper what you intend to get from this hour and 15 minutes, why you've shown up, and what it is that you're going to be responsible for in taking away from this seminar, what you're going to be listening for, what your intention is. And I'd invite you to write that down on a piece of paper. And you could also use the chat feature, actually. I haven't done this with Zoom before, but of course the chat feature would work just as well. If you would like to share it with other folks, you're welcome to do that. And you're welcome to keep it anonymous. Okay, and I'm going to share with you my intention of why I'm living and breathing at this moment, is to empower you to feel better about grant writing, to feel less daunted by it, and to give you the confidence and the skills, some confidence and skills to write some grant proposals for your communities. And I have two children, a 24-year-old and an 18-year-old. And I know that all of you are working for a world that I would like my children to become adults in and have grandchildren in. And so I would love it if it served you in making our communities better. So that's my intention, that you're left with at least one or two things that you can take away from this for grant writing. And I'm just looking at the chats now that, all right, someone's got a big grant application coming up this year and they want some tips on that. Actually, I'm thinking of putting together a webinar on project management for big grants. So maybe I can mention a little bit more about that. And somebody else, Valentine, has said, learn tips about the best ways to write successful grants for a nonprofit, and Arenda Healing International. I would love that. And Magenta is, I'd love to feel less intimidated by grant writing, and I'd like to know where to look for grants. We're going to talk about that, and what kinds of grants are a good fit for my organization. And lastly, I'd like to know some tips for writing a good grant application, as I've written several in the last few years and successfully, and that is just demoralizing. I know that, and so I will do my best. I do want to point out that we have, an hour of something that can take hours and days to teach. So when I talked to Don, we talked about doing sort of a 20,000 foot overview, but I'm hoping that it's useful and that you can walk away with a better sense of where you can develop your skills some more. So the first thing is I have a couple of resources for you, and Donna, if you can move to the next slide for me, please. This is a few years ago. I wrote a book based on interviews with 25 people who are successful grant writers, and collectively they had 454 years of experience. They'd written almost 25,000 proposals, and they'd raised $1.7 billion. The average amount raised was $67 million. And they had an average success rate of 74%. And I want you to pay attention to that. These are people who are experts, been doing it for a very long time, and their success rate was 74%. So you can imagine that the average success rate for someone who isn't as experienced is going to be lower than that too. So for you to be more, to be realistic about things. And I also interviewed people with gender, geography, and field of interest variety. And what came of that was a ton of information that I was gleaning through and looking for what it is that they do that has them be really successful. And I was flying actually to California. I was reading through all of my notes, and I was reading Guns, Germs, and Steel at the time, and he talks about the Anna Karenina principle. And if you can put the next slide on for me, please. Yeah, there we go. So I'm going to read this to you. So happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And by that sentence, Tolstoy meant that in order to be happy, a marriage must succeed in many different respects: sexual attraction, agreement about money, child discipline, religion, in-laws, and other vital issues. Failure in any one of those essential respects can doom a marriage, even if it has all the other ingredients needed for happiness. The principle can be extended to understanding much else about life besides marriage. We tend to seek easy, single-factor explanations of success, but for most things, though, success actually requires avoiding many separate possible causes of failure. And when I read that, I'm like, oh, that's what I'm looking at. There isn't they just do this, they do this. It was actually a combination of all of the things that they successfully did and avoided separate causes of possible causes of failure. And so the way I saw it was it's kind of like links in a chain, and that there were these links in a chain, and if you ignore any one of those links, then the chain will be weak and fall apart. And so in the book I identified these 25 links, and if you can move to the next slide for me, please. And this is the book, and I'm talking about it. It's available on a gift basis on my website. You're welcome to go there and download it. And if you can go to the next slide for me, please. I also put together a self-assessment quiz based on the book, based on the 25 links. So you can take that quiz, and I've been told by people that taking the quiz is actually helpful for them in seeing what they might skip over just in itself, answering the questions. I'm like, oh yeah, that thing. I don't do that thing. And so it takes about 15, 20 minutes to take the quiz, and you're welcome to go and take the quiz and get the results. They don't come immediately. I actually have to press a button in the background for it to make it work. And I'm actually going to automate it, but that's not done just yet. So you will get the results, but it may take 24 hours for it to hit your inbox. And let me know if not. So I do want to share those resources with you because they're greater than I can possibly share in an hour, and hopefully would give you some good information. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, great. So there's two, actually, I think there's really three elements of grant writing. The first is the context from which we undertake grant writing. And I think that's something that most people who teach grant writing don't talk about. And I absolutely think it's vital. And I am going to be talking about it today. What is more obvious is the process with which we undertake it. So it's a process of visioning, knowing what it is that you're going to be applying for, doing the research, finding the right foundations to apply to, building the relationships with people at the foundations or government agencies, and then planning exactly what it is that you would apply for. And there's a little bit of chicken and egg with the research, relationship building, and planning, because you can do the planning first. It's actually part of the visioning process. But then once you do the research, you're like, actually nobody's really interested in funding that, but if I adapt it this way, and that still works for me, that might be a better fit. Or the same, you may go to and to have a conversation with a program officer and realize there's like a particular audience that they might be interested in that you hadn't thought about. So there's a little bit of kind of a chicken and egg of planning and finding the fit. And not adapting your fit so much that it doesn't work for you. We'll talk more about that. And then the writing process. And I think grant writing is a bit of a misnomer, because if you look at that, there's 5 elements and only one of them is writing. And if you do all the other pieces well, the writing comes much more easily. And so don't just think of it as just writing. It's really an entire process. And the structure of grants, this is a very common structure that we see, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but there's an introductory statement, there's a problem statement. It's usually called a problem. I really dislike that, but that's the common vernacular. Goals and objectives, a methods or actions section, an evaluation section, so you can tell what has been accomplished, a budget, and a sustainability plan. It doesn't always have a sustainability plan, but you do see them pretty commonly. And the next slide, please. There we go. All right, so I've been doing this for a long time and certainly have faced burnout myself. I've raised 2 children while being a grant writer and consulting. I've had my fair share of staying up until 2 in the morning and being absolutely exhausted. And I hit the point where I just refused to do that anymore. It was just too much for me, for my family, and I just was not willing to operate in that way. And so really set myself some hard boundaries of how I would be working. And what I discovered in that was amazing things happened. Little miracles appeared when I refused to work past 3 o'clock in the afternoon when my children came home. And even when I'm working on a massive deadline. And so what I've come to realize is that we can approach grant writing in a way that is nourishing. And when we undertake it from the old fear-based paradigms of separation and competition and scarcity, it constricts us and it depletes us, and it's exhausting and frightening and confronting. But when we can take some time and consciously root ourselves in coming from a place of love and generosity, remembering that sufficiency exists and that we can collaborate and work as we do the grant writing, those qualities are left nourished by the process and are more successful. So it's really a triple whammy. And if you think about this, you know, when you write an email and you're annoyed and you're angry and it just kind of comes through, even though the words are perfectly nice, the annoyance comes through in the grant writing. It's the same thing with in the email. It's the same thing in grant writing. The place from which you write just shines through in the writing, whether you intend it or not. And so giving ourselves the gift of rooting ourselves in these more empowering contexts and places, I just think is a win-win-win. And I've practiced this. I am not perfect at it, I'm for sure, but I think it's something worth generating and worth doing. And so that's what I'm going to be speaking from today, even though I'm covering a lot of sort of basic information about grant writing. So if we could go to the next place, please. Thank you. So I want to, before we dive into the nitty-gritty of you know, how to do research and that kind of thing, I want to talk about what the grant writing process is about. And I want to tell you a story that I was, quite a few years ago now, actually. I went with my son to Costa Rica. And I'm British, and I live in upstate New York in Ithaca. And I had never been to the rainforest before. And for those of you who have not been to the rainforest, it is an incredible place. It was just this cacophony of sound and a sensory depth and beauty where, you know, you could hear lots of frogs and birds, and it was moist on your skin, and you know, it was dark and light, and just a huge amount of life, of all different kinds of plants. And one of the things that I'm very, very grateful that I did is we hired a guide from the local community to take us into the middle of the rainforest. And he was a young man who'd grown up there, and it was just a real delight to go with him. And at one point we're in the middle of the forest, and he points out this enormous tree. It must have, I'm not very good with height, but I'm going to say it was like 200 feet high. It was huge, and it had this enormous girth, and it was, you know, dripping with lichens, and it was just alive with all different kinds of plants growing on it. And he points out at the bottom of the tree trunk, there was this little pile of dung. And he said that dung is absolutely essential in this ecosystem, because he said it's from this little beetle that lives in one of the lichens on the tree, and then it comes down and it creates this little pile of dung. And then there are some essential nutrients in that dung that goes into the soil, and from that this tree survives. And so what it looks like from the outside is there's this enormous tree that's, you know, king of the jungle or queen of the jungle, that is, you know, dominant and bestows its goodness on the creatures all around. But what was really clear was how dependent that tree was from I'm sorry, I'm distracted by the chat. I'll just ignore that. How dependent that tree was from all of the other life forms around it. And so it reminded me of grant writing, because I'm a grant writer. And so what it looks like is that there are foundations that have huge amounts of money that they can bestow their largesse on the community, and we apply for it and we depend upon them. But it also works in the other way, that foundations are just as dependent upon us. And how they're dependent upon us is they don't have a lot of the things that we have. And we often fail to understand how valuable we are in the ecosystem. And what I mean by that is, especially for the kinds of projects that you're working on, we often have connections with community connections that take years, if not decades, to build trust, collaboration, and network. Might have the capacity to go into a community and hold a community meeting or a town hall meeting that you could pull off pretty easily, and a large foundation coming in from out of town would have no chance of doing. you also understand what is needed. You've been thinking about it for a long time. You've been studying it. You've been talking to people. You know what the root causes are of a problem. And you often come up with solutions that that people from the outside don't. So while a foundation might be staffed by and have money given by somebody or a group with deep pockets and a large amount of money, they have a dream in their heart. There's something deep within them that is pulling them to create a better world. And we are people who feel a similar pull to create something more beautiful and create the world that our hearts knows is possible, as Charles Eisenstein says. And that both of our hearts are resonating and feeling that. And when we write a grant proposal that is well crafted, well thought out, logical and precise, but comes from that deeply rooted desire within our heart, and it gets expressed in a grant proposal, it lands, it resonates with the people who read it, and has a greater chance of being successful. And so what it looks like on the outside is, here's this foundation, gives money to a nonprofit, but what it really is, I think, is a divine transaction where there is a place deeply rooted in our souls where our heart's intentions cross and money changes hand, and a third thing is created that wouldn't possibly be created without the grant proposal process going along its way. And just as a foundation couldn't possibly put projects into place all the way that they want because they have money, but they lack many other things. And just like you don't have the money, but you have many other things that you can bring to the table. And when those are brought together in unison to work for the greater good, and then this third element, this divine prayer can get expressed. And so that's why I say that grant writing can be a form of sacred service, that it's bringing something beautiful into the world that wouldn't exist otherwise. And for me, that's a more empowering way of working at it. It may not be true, who knows? It's just a context that we can create for ourselves. And but I believe it's a more empowering context than going begging at the door for something. So if there are any questions that are coming in, Don, please kind of jump in. And if not, I will move on to the next section.
I see one, it may be putting the cart before the horse. It's about state and federal grants. I don't know if you want to talk.
Let's leave that because it may be better. We'll have a better context after we've gone through some of the section, and my guess is. And so maybe after the next couple of sections, we can pop back to that one. So.
Great. Please keep typing your questions into the Q&A as we go along.
Yeah, feel free to do that. So great. So then if you go to the next slide for me, we're going to talk about some kind of preliminary things that people skip over and are vital. So the first is to really assess whether your organization is grant ready. And you actually need to have a pretty significant number of things in place before you can win grants. For one, you need to have 501c3 status, a nonprofit status, or you need to partner with an organization that does. And one of the options for that is going to like a community foundation and asking them to sponsor, to be what's called a fiscal sponsor, which means that they submit the application. They are responsible for the reporting, and they are responsible for the reporting to the IRS. So it's one of kind of the workarounds if you're a tiny new organization and don't have 501c3 status yourself, 501c3 nonprofit status. And But you do need to, even if you're young and tiny, you do need to think through whether you're ready for a grant. It is a responsibility. It's a legal contract. When you put a proposal in, you're agreeing to do something. It's not, I think there's an understanding that, somebody just gives you $10,000. It's not. They don't just give you 10 or 20 or $30,000. They give you some money for a particular project, and it's your responsibility to follow through on that. So before you even think about grant writing, you want to be honest with yourself about whether you're ready for this. And to make sure that when you do go forward. So I've given a couple of resources here. One is a colleague of mine, Linda Butler, has put together a checklist to see whether you're grant ready. And the PDF, the link to the PDF is there. And then there's also this list of questions that a program officer might ask that was put together by the Akron Community Foundation, and I can't find it on the web anymore, but I kept a copy, so Don is going to show that to you, and I think you can do that. And we won't go through it in detail because it's too much, but you will be able to see it from this recording, and I'm sure Don will be able to send you a copy so that you could work through it at your leisure. And we've got a funky white line, but hopefully we can see some questions here. And if that's not going to work, he can send. It's a 2-page list of questions that they may ask you. So here we go. All right. So this is a really fun thing when you can role play with someone, or you can do it yourself. I still use this list when I'm working on a new project. I go through this list of pretending I'm on the phone. Who do you represent? What do you do, and how much do you want? How much do you want, and what for? Really direct questions. And what services do you provide, and who's on your board, and what kind of track record do you have? And my guess is that any organization, for any project, if you go through that list, there's going to be some that you don't know the answers to immediately, and you might have to dig a little bit, and you might have to pick up some information, or you might have to create an answer where one doesn't exist. So feel free to ask Don for this list, or maybe we can somehow attach it to the materials that get sent to you.
I'll send it in the follow-up email.
Yeah, that would be great. So, and they gave me permission to share this with you, so there is a second page. So if we can skip back to the PowerPoint, that would be great. And so what you need to be thinking is, okay, I'm an organization that has my ducks in a row. I've thought about how I would answer those questions. And you also want to think about how you exist within your community, or your word of mouth and your reputation. Once somebody told me years ago that people don't give grants to projects, they give grants to people. And I think there's a ton of truth in that. You may have a good organization, you may have a good project, but if there's not trust in the leadership or in how well the organization is run, it's going to have an impact. And I've also seen where there's just really strong, charismatic leaders who just make a difference in their capacity. So you want to be thinking about how credible you are as an organization. And things to pay attention to is, what is your word of mouth reputation? Funders talk to each other. They go to events together. They do talk about us, which is fine. But they have to pay attention to what would they say about you, and you may ask that too. Your social media presence, are you a brand new organization that just doesn't seem to really exist, except it has a website that someone's put up? Or actually, do you seem to be serving a community and have a social media preference? You can also think about if you're new and you don't have these things, who could you partner with that does? And maybe the first time you take a foray into grant writing, you do it with them. And you can kind of piggyback on their success and their reputation, and as you build your own. If you do have a small initial grant, maybe someone gave you $5,000 or $10,000, you can ask them to refer you to other funders. And I've seen this happen pretty often, where they're like, we're not funding this type of thing anymore, but have you tried so-and-so? Because I think they're opening up an initiative around this. And then the other thing is, it's never hurts to have publicity for things that you do well. If you have an event or something that has gone well, to be aware that that funders read newspapers, they pay attention to social media to see what's going on, and good publicity is helpful. And so next slide, please. All right. So you want to take time to plan, and you want to do this well, but you also don't want to get totally bogged down in it. I've seen this with some nonprofits; they get bogged down in visioning for years. Don't do that, but also do make sure that you don't skip this. So you want to take the time to bring partners on board that would be good people for you organizations for you to partner with, to generate a common vision for your entire team. And don't forget to include your key constituencies if they are verbal human beings. And to be careful about differentiating your organizational needs from the community needs. So what tends to happen is they say, an organization will say, we need a van, for example, for transportation. And that is not a need. That is an organizational need, but it's not a community need. The community need might be that there are children in a city who have no capacity or exposure to nature and to the outdoors. And the impact on that is higher rates of attention deficit and lack of understanding about the connection between what they eat and the natural world, and understanding themselves as animal bodies that eat. And that is a need. And the van is a vehicle, right? The van is a vehicle for bringing those children into maybe to a farm and then bringing them back again. So you want to pay attention to how you're thinking of needs. What comes up immediately for most people are the organizational needs. Those are the easiest to get to, but then you want to drill down and go down one layer to look at the needs. And then you want to articulate clear goals and objectives. And this is essential for grant writing. I don't have time to go into it here, but you can. You need to be able to understand what a goal is and a clear objective. It needs to be measurable, and so that a funder can see what you're planning on doing. You want to avoid having sort of general, like, oh, we're going to make the world a better place. We're going to reduce climate change. There's no way that you can actually measure those things unless you're an international global organization. And so you want to think about what are some small measurable objectives and goals that you can achieve. And so the next slide, please. So the best way of identifying funders is there's something called the Foundation Center, and it's foundationcenter.org. They have a free foundation finder, and also a 990 finder. And what a 990 is when there's a foundation, they have to file a tax form called a 990 with the government each year. And in the tax form, it lists in there a whole bunch of information, but one of the things it lists in there is who they give funds to and what grants they gave and to whom. And so that is actually incredibly useful information. It also has contact information in there. And but there's a limit to how much you can kind of glean from those, because they're not really very searchable. But the paid subscription is searchable. It's not inexpensive. I think it's a couple of $100 for a month. And but there are many ways that you can access it for free. Some community foundations have subscriptions. Universities do, and you can go to a university library and use them. That's true in my town. And also the Foundation Center has collections at participating libraries. So they are based in New York City, but so for example, the university or the library in Atlanta or San Francisco, I think they have cooperating collections there. So do your best to ask around and see if you can get your fingers on the paid subscription, or you can, join for a month or two while you do your research. And it really is incredibly valuable. When you do find, and you can put in keyword searches, that's one of my favorite ways of doing it. You can look for foundations who give grants in your particular community, in your state, along your topic. You can look for, one of my favorite ways is other organizations like yours and see who funds them. That's a really good way. And so it's pretty intuitive to use. And what you want to do is pay attention to what they actually do versus what they say, because they're not always aligned. So they may, for example, say that they fund environmental causes, but when you look at it, 90% of their funding has gone to education, and another 5% or 3% to healthcare, and only 2 or 3 grants to the environment. So just because in the Foundation Center it says we fund environmental causes, doesn't necessarily mean that they do. It might mean they've done it once in California. And so you want to kind of look at what they've really funded. And that information is on the 990 and also in the Foundation directory. So one of the sad but true things is you're probably more likely to get into Harvard than you are to get a grant with some foundations. It's getting increasingly competitive, and there are many foundations where their success rate is 5%, and Harvard's success rate is 5.7. So you don't want to run into this as all I have to do is ask for money and I'll get it, because that just isn't true. So the best use of your time is being incredibly selective and knowing, just like when you do a college research, where's the best place for you to apply? Where do you have the best shot? And put your resources and energy into that. So you want to do your research, be really selective, and put your energy into, just as you would for college, put your energy into your top 10 options and whittle out all of the other options. Don't come up with a list of 100 and send this scattershot email or a letter to them and think it's going to pan out. You want to actually dig into it and use your time wisely, rather than doing, like mile wide, 1 inch deep. You want to go a foot deep and 10 inches wide. I told you I wasn't great with space and time. So, okay. So next slide, please. Okay. So when you do find foundations, read their website, look at any printed materials, look at which organizations are highlighted. There are their pet projects. Look at the photographs. Photographs are really telling. What do they photograph? Are the things that they love. And they may have hardly any instruction on how to apply. It may simply say, we have no deadlines, send us a proposal. They may say, send us a letter of interest, which means a 1-2-page letter with a synopsis of what you're wanting to fund. Sometimes they have, more commonly these days for the larger organizations, They have like a little online form. You just put in a paragraph about what you're interested in, and then they'll let you know if they're interested. And some larger foundations will release what's called an RFP, a request for proposals, and that they are guidelines. Like, we're wanting to fund watershed projects in Northern California, and or we're wanting to fund projects to mitigate the effects of the fire in California, and we only are entertaining applications from organizations that are based in California and have been practicing there for the last 5 years, something like that. They'll give you more detailed guidelines. So you want to look to see if there are any RFPs that have come out. Even if they're not active at the moment, you can always contact them and ask if they'll release them again. Almost all government funding comes from RFPs, from requests for proposals. And I'm not going to go into that too much. I'll answer that question about state and government, but given that most people don't have a lot of experience on this call, you'll be focusing on smaller foundation level grants. And the next slide, please. Okay. Let's take a breath. I need to take a breath. So these photographs, by the way, many of them are from when I walked the Camino de Santiago with my daughter a couple of years ago. So this is, for those of you who are interested in the Camino, this is what it looks like a lot. I'm going to read a poem. Do not be dismayed by the brokenness of the world. All things break, and all things can be mended. Not with time, as they say, but with intention. So go, love intentionally, extravagantly, unconditionally. The broken world waits in darkness for the light that is you. And I love that because of the power of intention, which is what we started with in the beginning, that it makes a difference when you set a good intention. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so I want to just touch on this, which is absolutely key, which is the context of sufficiency. And for those of you who have not read Lynn Twist's book, and I noticed I've left an E off her name, it has Lynn with an E. She has this beautiful book called The Soul of Money. It is absolutely worth reading if you've not read it. And in it, she talks about sufficiency as a context that we bring forth from within, that reminds us that if we look around and within ourselves, we will find what we need. There is always enough. And what I want to point out here is she's not saying that sufficiency exists in the way that there is, a gallon of water when there clearly isn't a gallon of water. She's saying it's a context, it's a point of view, it's a way that we can look at the world, that there are sufficient resources. And sometimes those are external resources, those are our connections, those are skills and objects that are around us. And sometimes those are resources that are within ourselves or within our communities. So, for example, even when things are not going well, a context of sufficiency is, I know myself to be resilient, and I know myself to reach out for support. As much as a context of sufficiency is, I can write well. And this is one thing I want to point out to you, that if you can write a college level essay, you can write a grant proposal. There is a lot of mystique around it, and it is not rocket science. There is definitely an art to it. There are some things that you need to know, but the writing piece of it of itself is simply logical argument. It's clarity. It's something that's well thought out, well reasoned, well put together. And if you've done that in college and you've thrived, you can write a grant proposal. And if you haven't, and it's not your strength, go partner with somebody else who is good at that. You probably may have skills in other areas that are part of the process. For example, doing research, you might be great at that, or you might be great at building relationships. Not everyone is a great writer, and one of the tricks of this is recognizing when you're not and when you can partner with someone. So next slide, please. All right, so do you need to contact foundations? Yes, absolutely. Easier said than done. Some foundations are not very approachable, some are. Those that are, you want to absolutely have conversations with them. And those that are not approachable, you need to do some background work and find where you have commonalities, where you have linkages, and see if you can make contact. And the key thing to be thinking about when you're reaching out to a foundation is this quote by St. Francis: "Seek not to be understood as to understand." Do not treat foundation program officers like objects, people that you have to sell. Do not be a car salesman. A much more powerful place is to come from understanding that they have a dream for the world that is as beautiful as yours, and to listen to what that is, and to hear if there's an alignment. And if there is, that's beautiful. And if there isn't, you can bow to them with grace. And is it going to the next slide, Don? Hi, no, mine's frozen. There we go. Okay. So communicate effectively and see where you have a mutual passion. You might not. You might realize there's like a little doesn't quite fit, and it's totally fine. Be willing to hear no as much as you are yes. What the mistakes I hear is that people are so focused on wanting to hear yes that they don't hear when there are hints that it's not a good fit. Tell the truth always, even when it might make you look bad. It's amazing how doing that actually makes you look better sometimes. And don't gloss over things and pretend everything's hunky-dory when it isn't. It's much better to talk to a program officer what the real challenges are for your community and your environment and your organization, and get real. There's a power in doing that. And treat each other with respect. I actually have a quote, I think it's later on, but I'll tell it to you now. Somebody that I interviewed for my book, she'd been a program officer, and she said that it was amazing how few people actually said thank you to her when she had gone out of her way to help them. And she said in the years that she worked as a program officer, I'll read this to you. It says, "Funders are people too. Treat them with respect and not disdain. Remember to thank them when you get the grant because they advocated for you or your cause. I can tell you the number of times people got back to me and said, thank you so much. You were really helpful to us. And I don't mean the kind of thank you that says on behalf of such and such an organization, thank you for the grant, like a really personal thank you." And she told me actually that, and she'd been doing it for more than a decade, she'd had less than 5 people in that time actually say thank you for helping with the grant application process. So put yourself in that top 2% by simply being a human being. All right, so next slide, please. Okay, so keys for winning. Okay, and I probably, if I can go for 5, 6, 7 minutes more, is that about right, John, before we do questions? I'm trying to get a good sense of timing.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, great. So the next slide, please. So these are the components. First, there's going to be a summary. It's read first, best to write it last. Sometimes it is the only thing that is read in a grant application, so make it absolutely beautiful. The next component is the introduction, and this is where you introduce your organization. And your real goal with this section is not to bore people to tears and have them want to keep reading. They're under no obligation to keep reading your proposal, absolutely none. So you have to keep having them read. And so make your introduction interesting. Do not say, "We were founded in 1962. And in 1963, we moved across the road to a new building and started housing women in our facility. Do not do that. It is boring as heck. The next section is a problem statement or a need statement. And that is a summary of what the issues are that you're addressing. And you want to make, it's very important when you're doing this, that you make them measurable. So for example, you may be working on climate change, but there is no way that you are going to, with even a $100,000 grant, have a measurable difference on climate change on a global scale. So you want to think about what is the problem or the need that I can measure within my community, within my purview, that I would be able to measure by the end of the proposal or by the end of the grant. You definitely want to use data and do some research to find some good baseline data, or explain how you would collect baseline data. And you don't want to make it a total sob story, but you want to make them care. Someone should read that and like, wow. You have to remember that when people are reading this, you're going to be up against all different kinds of proposals, from, you know, services that support people who've left abusive environments, children that aren't getting fed, you know, some really dire homelessness and some needs. And it's important that people know that this needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed now. And if it's not done now, there's going to be a problem. And so, excuse me. I'm sorry, I'm just getting over a cold. So the next are objectives. And you want to write both outcome objectives and process objectives. And I'm not going to go into that now because it'll overwhelm you. Sufficiently to say you need to have good goals and objectives. And I'll give you some resources at the end, actually, for learning more about this, or you could Google it. And that you want to think about what it is that you want to achieve from the grant. And then the next section is the method section. So how you're going to accomplish the desired change and why you think your plan will work. The best way of structuring this section is who's going to do what, when, where, how, and why. And the most important one that people don't focus on enough is the why. When you answer why that place, why that person, why that community, why that particular curriculum, why now, why 3 months versus 6 months, then your expertise and your understanding of the problem really comes out from you articulating that. And so next slide, please. The next section is evaluation. So how you can tell you've been successful. How are you going to measure those objectives that you put together? The budget needs to, you can't, for some small foundation grants, you can just ask for $10,000, but more often they'll want it broken down into, you know, are you buying equipment? Do you need staff time? Do you need space rental? You know, how the money is going to get spent. A foundation program officer told me one time that 70% of their budgets came in wrong. So that's another place where you can be in the top 5% really easily, well, in the top 30%, I guess. Just making sure that your budget heads up will make a difference in the proposals. Dissemination. This isn't always included in foundation proposals. It's more often seen in government. And that's your plan for disseminating information about the project. And then sustainability or future funding. This is where you address how the project's going to keep going after the grant funding. And quite honestly, it's always made up. A few times you actually have a solid plan for how it's going to continue. You know, you may have a city that says, we will adopt it after 3 years and fully pay for it. And that's kind of rare, but it happens sometimes. And what you want to do there is just make up something good. And I actually have an article on writing a good sustainability plan, and I will actually put that on my website. And so on my blog, you'll be able to find that. And I just wrote a note to do that for you. And next slide, please. So when you're writing, take the time to write well. If you don't write well, ask a friend to help or a colleague to help. Use an active voice. Do not use passive voice. Use first person. If you're submitting it on paper, use wide margins and lots of white space. And a picture speaks 1,000 words. You can do something really beautiful with photographs. Notice what having photographs in this presentation has done. And next slide, please. And how you can differentiate yourself from others is keep the reader in mind at all times and make it easy for them to read your proposal and tell a story. Stories are so powerful. And I have a friend she's a professional storyteller. And she said to me once that stories are not words, stories are images. So if you can paint an image with words, you want to do that. You want to put a visual in someone's mind. And I'm going to read you a quote from my book. And this was written by a guy who ran a theater in New York City. He said, years ago, we won a $100,000 grant from the Tony Randall Theatrical Fund in their first year of an open competition. The fund was administered by Tony's widow and a panel of people that she gathered to review the proposals. Apparently, I don't know if I was the only one, but one of only very few people who actually bothered to do any research about what was important to Tony and to talk about that in the proposal. Everyone described their projects, and I described my project as well, but I spent more time trying to get a grip on how to talk to them specifically in a way that I thought would be meaningful. Not just a compelling project, but a project that I thought Tony would like. Maybe I'm a little better suited to thinking about who the audience is than some others, because I have an audience every night. I'm not sure that every grant developer is thinking about who is reading, or I hope everyone is, but I have a much more experience with the audience feedback than most grant developers have, because I stand in the lobby every night when we do a show. And I love that quote. That tells you the power of research, the power of connection with your reader. And I bet you he tells a damn good story when he's writing too. So, all right, next slide, please. Okay, here are some common pitfalls, and I'm just going to go through these. Next slide, please. Not articulating a clear vision of where your organization is headed and why. Being inconsistent in your message internally and externally. What that means is if a funder were to talk to you or any member of your organization or any board member or any staff member, they would hear the same thing about your organization and about your project. And next slide. Giving up too easily in the face of defeat. There's a fine line here between being resilient and knowing when to go back. And you can expect some funders will expect to turn you down 2 or 3 times before they say yes, which is extremely frustrating to me, but that's the way it is. And so don't take no for an answer the first time, but that also need to couple that with the wisdom of knowing where the good place is to put your time. Know that that's a funder that you have a strong likelihood if you do keep going back. And responding to the funder's desires rather than your own vision. And begging. Do not beg. People make the mistake of thinking if they position themselves as weak that people will want to give them funding, and it is not the case. You want to be the winning horse in the race, except that you don't have their support. And there's a quote from my book is, I realized it was important to view myself as an applicant, not a supplicant for grant funds. Too many grant applications take the posture of more or less of begging a sponsor for funds in their proposal. They seem to confuse addressing a need or a problem with appearing needy themselves. I don't think humility sells a proposal, and I've never been very good at it anyway. So, next page, please. So for writing, the writer who breathes more words than he needs is making a chore for the reader who reads. And that is the key to writing well. Next slide, please. When and how to follow up with a proposal. Wait 3 months. It often takes a while for them to review your proposals. I found contacting or calling Tuesday through Thursday works better than Mondays and Fridays. And send a thank you for considering your proposal. And next slide, please. I recommend trying again at least twice unless they tell you not to, and ask for feedback. Many places will give you feedback, and it can be really helpful. It can help you see I shouldn't bother again, or it can help you see what you could do to strengthen your application, and go back with a stronger application the next time. And yeah. All right, so do we have some questions?
We do have a few, and maybe some more will come in. You can post them to the Q&A module or the chat. I think start with this one from Brian McGavin. Where do you stand with a great proposal in an area of interest to a foundation where the grant foundation says we do not accept unsolicited proposals?
That's the bane of my existence at the moment. It's happening more and more. Honestly, billionaires are setting up foundations and not accepting applications. I can understand why, that they don't want to be barraged, but there's also a part of me that is, you've just been given a whacking great tax break to create a foundation. And there's a part of me that's annoyed that you can say, thanks for the tax break, don't call us, we'll call you. However, it is the way that it is. And it's frustrating. The way around that is through painstaking relationship building. I worked with one organization where it was exactly that. I saw a really good fit for them, but they didn't accept applications. And what they did was they told their staff, they were reasonably large, a middle-sized organization, and they told all of their staff members that they were looking for a connection with this particular foundation. And 6 months or a year later, one of their staff members was at a soccer game for her kids and found herself standing next to someone who was a board member of that foundation. And I think I'd probably given them the list of board members, so she kind of knew who that was. And she struck up a conversation. They said, yeah, we'd be interested. Just invited them to come for a tour. They came for a tour. They eventually ended up with a significant grant. It was well over 100,000, but it took 2-3 years for that to come about. One of the things people don't recognize is that you have more connections than you realize. People tell me, oh, we're small, we don't have any connections. I have never found that to be the case. I once worked with this tiny organization in Ithaca with a board of 5 people, and that was it. And I gave them a list of foundations that were a good fit. It turned out that somebody on a board of a foundation in San Francisco was a cousin of someone on the board in Ithaca. It's like it always happens. There are connections. The 6 degrees of separation, or I think Facebook's found it to be less, right? They found it to be like 3.5 or something. You have connections more than you realize. So, but it takes time, and you can try sending something to them. I've never found that that works. I did one time send an application in and realized I shouldn't have sent it in because we were in the wrong state or something, and we ended up getting a grant. And it turned out it was because somebody on the board of the foundation had a brother who was a member of the Catholic order that I was writing for, and so we got the grant. So there's all kind of crazy things that happen, but I don't have any great suggestions for you other than try, and don't put all your eggs in that basket. It's a long shot. and it may pay off, but don't have it as, the next great white hope for your organization. You need to have some backups. So hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Just because of the time, I'm going to move on to another question from Teresa. Hopefully say your last name correctly. Konechne. How to find grants for projects that span many different aspects that don't fit into a silo. Like my org that deals with climate change, art, emotional aspects of climate change, and community engagement.
How would I deal with that? I would pick the angle that is the most likely to sell. And environmental organizations and arts organizations are kind of notorious for for being having fewer funders with smaller grants. But if, say, for example, if there was an angle where it was working with children in the arts around the environment, and you had a local foundation that was really interested in children's education, I would go that. I would take that angle. So I would pick one of them, and you need to do the research here, is like find out which offers you the best options, and then weave the other pieces into it. So choose a foundation that's focused on the environment, and talk to them about the importance of the arts for them, and that's how I would handle that. You're probably not going to find a foundation that has that perfect amalgamation, so choose your best options and go with
that. Okay. We have another question from Tahira Hamdani. Are there resources or clubs for having your grant proposals peer reviewed without having to pay a grant writing expert?
Not any that I know, but I do know grant writers who do it for each other. I know, I once worked with, I had a colleague, and she had a long-standing relationship with, she was on the East Coast, the other person was on the West Coast. One worked on housing, one worked in I don't know, education or something, and they used to read each other's proposals because they would never compete, and they were different fields, different locations, and she said it worked out great. So you could set that up, maybe through Facebook you can find someone, or maybe through this, it'd be a great thing through this network, and somebody that you trust, somebody whose judgment you trust and their integrity that they trust. I have heard of found people lifting proposals and using them. So it has to be someone that has good integrity. But yeah, it's something that's definitely done. I don't know of a resource where you can kind of go and do that. But if you find one, let me know, because I'd love to know, and it'd be a great thing to share with other people. So
nice. Albie Halperin asks, we're getting many thank you for this presentation. So lots of good feedback. She asks, can you talk more about project management for large grants, both internally and with potential collaborators, letters of support?
Yeah, actually, I teach a longer grant writing course, and somebody in my course just asked me that same thing. So I'm actually thinking that in March or April, I'm going to do a webinar like this, like an hour and a half, on managing the process and managing collaborations, because it is an issue. The short version, the most useful thing about project planning is build in plenty of cushion for yourself. I will give people false deadlines, and make it safe for people to say no. That is the most useful thing. Is you right from the get-go, you need to ask people if they have done this before, if they're comfortable doing it, if they have anything in the background, family, that would stop them from being able to meet a deadline. You and the part, what that rests on is, this is not about getting a proposal in by the deadline. It's about what you're all committed to. So it's about, children having food when they come home at the end of the day. It is about climate change. It is about something bigger than me and meeting a deadline, and about you and me judging you for not getting something done or not being able to. What really matters the most is that this project is accomplished. And so make it really safe. It's like, given that context, what is, can you collaborate on this? Can we work on this together? And if not, fine, and we'll find somebody else who can work with us on this. And it's the same about asking people about meeting a deadline. Can you meet this deadline? If not, that's okay, but tell me now, because if you don't meet the deadline 2 weeks from now, I'm going to be in a mess, and this is not going to happen. And then that's the impact that it's going to have. Is this project is, there's going to be hungry kids. I don't want that. You don't want that. So let's play on the same team together. And that I've always found is the most helpful way of working together. So that was the short version.
Okay, so I think we'll take 2 more questions, because I want to give Jana a little time at the end to sum things up and talk about her Grant Writers Well program. So we have one question from Magenta and one from Lynn. Magenta's question is, any tips for foundation or funder research when your organization is particularly radical and futurist?
Good luck.
That probably relates to a lot of people on this call.
Yeah, there was a book written, I think it was in the 80s, maybe in the 70s or 80s. It was called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. There are a smattering foundations that will fund disruptive things, foundations. So one of the analogy actually that I didn't put in here that is true is somebody had said once that foundations are like banks. You don't want to go asking for a loan from the bank looking really ratty and that you really need the money. You go in looking like you're going to repay them. And foundations are pretty conservative. They like to, take on projects they think are going to succeed, and so you want to go in from that stance of, we've got it all together except for the money. And radical, the best way of looking for searching for them is if you look for keyword of grassroots. Often grassroots kicks up those foundations. Ben and Jerry's is one, and there's one in Colorado, a couple in California, but not the easiest thing. But the way I see it too is we need to start doing some things pretty darn radically. Otherwise, we're facing not being in the capacity to make any grants, because none of us are going to be here. So I think we need to start talking straight to each other. So,
and I think for that, I'm curious if you would agree with this. That we keep doing our radical work, that we don't let the tail wag the dog. We keep doing our radical work, but when we send in a grant proposal, it's about how practical this will be, how practical the benefits will be, without getting into the huge overarching philosophy of why we're doing this.
Yeah, you can play the game. I mean, it's frustrating for me too about everything has to be measured. And try sending in a grant proposal where you're not measuring something. And yet so
Mhm.
many of the most important things in our world cannot be measured. And but that's the game. That's the rules were made, and those are the ones that we need to follow to get the funding. So it is what it is, much as we'd like it to be. It's something different sometimes.
Yeah. All right. And last question. I see we have a couple more come in, but Lynn Hartle has one about I keep finding grants that have online proposals, and each section of the grant has very limited wording. For example, 2,000 characters. It's hard to say what I want. Any tips?
It's hard. It's incredibly time consuming. It's happening more and more, and they do it. I've been told one of the reasons is it makes it easier for them to review, and then they can also do keyword searches more easily. But as far, sometimes it takes out all the formatting, so it just like scrunches everything together. The word limitations, it takes time. It really does, to take something that is 4 pages long and make it 2 pages. The most time consuming thing in writing is making something short. So if you know that, give yourself time. That's the best advice that I have. Don't expect it to be a fast process, and then hopefully you can reuse what you've done. That you don't just do it one time. That clarity of thinking, that condensation, synthesis. That it's something that you can use more than once.
So as you said at the outset, this we could spend days and days talking about all this, and it's just an hour and a half session. But I know you do have a course coming up. I can put that on the screen.
I do. So I offer an 8-week course which goes into all of these topics in more detail. There's video and live classes, and I do it as a small group, so it's actually really helpful for people in batting ideas around together. During the process, you do research and talk with funders. You can go through the whole process that we just talked about and draft a proposal, and we review it together as a group. I have a section that's starting in April and one in September. And there's a link which is very poor to see on here, but it's grantventureswell.com. And you're welcome to check that out. And I'm actually feeling inspired at the moment to try offering the April class on a pay what you can basis. And I haven't actually put that on the website yet. But if you go there and you're interested, just shoot me an email. And I'm feeling like I would like to offer it that way and see how that goes. And if there are not enough registrations for April, we'll move it to September. But that's the goal. And then the other, if you can go back one there we go. I put together a set of daily questions and guided meditations called the 11 Guiding Questions of Conscious Grant Writing. It's a little more focused for people who have more experience in grant writing, so it gives them a context. But, try it out if you've not done grant writing before, and I'd be kind of curious to see if this is good in creating a context when you're fresh and new. And so that is available on my website. And for the person who was asking about the program management, I do have a course already put together on that, and I actually haven't taught it online yet, but there's no reason why I couldn't. So if you sign up for actually any of the things that I've mentioned here, or just you can sign up for my blog email list on my website, and I will send out a notification when I offer that. And it'll be probably same kind of thing, maybe an hour and a half, and include some tools and ways of managing the process so that you get some sleep at night and are effective and still like people at the end of it. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jana. I hope this was useful to everybody who participated. Personally, I'd love to see a lot more resources flowing into the community resilience movement. Our world really needs it, and having some more resources at our disposal will make us a lot more effective in what we do. So we're really happy to have you here. I'm going to be posting the recording of this webinar to YouTube, as I said at the outset. And once that is uploaded in the next couple of days, I'll be sending everybody email with any additional resources Jana would like to share. I know the questions from Foundation staff. We'll make sure to include that. And would love for you all to fill out a short survey, both about this webinar and about what future webinars you'd like us to offer through Transition US. So thank you very much for taking 90 minutes out of your busy day to be here with us. And yeah, let's stay in touch.
And thank you for the work that you do. It's close to my heart, and I hope you succeed and thrive, and we shift and turn this this behemoth around.
Great. All right. Well, have a good rest of your day, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Jana.